Well, I'm pleased today to introduce Dr. Irwin Mandel. Irwin Mandel is an educator, researcher, awardee of the ADA Gold Medal Award for Excellence in Research. And so, Irwin, welcome to the International College of Dentistry video project.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to get started really with a conversation that we were almost having a little bit a while ago, and it sort of triggered something, and it was something that was said in a interview that was done with you about 10 years ago for an in-house Columbia University newsletter. And it really talked about some way accurately describing the profile of your activities, and it was called Dentistry as a Life, Not as a Living.
Mm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that meant.
Well, you know, it's interesting because where that term came from was actually an interview or an article with Reverend Coffin, who was the sorry, I'm trying to remember what his exact title, when he was at Yale, I guess, and he was in charge of the spiritual life of the students or what have you. And he was dealing with some aspects of the Nixon-Watergate situation. And one of the young men who was on the staff of Nixon had been at Yale and actually had taken some courses with Reverend Coffin, and he was impressed with him intellectually, but he was a little disappointed in him ethically. And I think at that time he pointed out that the difficulty there was that so much of our education is for a living, not a life. And I think that that aspect is even more prominent today, perhaps during this recent period where there was a little less of a sense of economic security, and so many people looked at the educational process purely in terms of training and learning, in a sense, marketable skills, and losing sight of the overall aspect of what they're about. And I think that's terribly important, especially in professional education and in dental school very specifically. With my experience, has been that what we have to deal with students is not only giving them the essentials for making a living, namely the appropriate base educationally, but a sense of what professionalism is all about, what interaction with patients is all about, that the life has to be broader than just an assembly line production of restorations, but it's providing a service to people, and also that they themselves have to be part of a continuing broadening process. And so it's education for a total life, not just for cranking out, as it were, a living.
So, and how does that translate to your life?
Well, I've been very lucky in my own life in that I was able to combine, in a sense, of both aspects. Is that, and that's why I'm so grateful to dentistry, is that it did provide me with a mechanism and a kind of training which provided the opportunity for a reasonable lifestyle, but more important, it provided the opportunity for an expansive life, both in practice and much more so in my case, because of a variety of circumstances, the opportunity to do research and to be part of exciting developments in the fields of oral biology, preventive dentistry, and so forth, so that I really had the best of both worlds. I had the intellectual stimulation and the security of a set of professional abilities and training that made it possible for me to have a reasonable lifestyle.
Let's track and see how that happened. You grew up in New York?
Yes, I actually born in Brooklyn, which is very much part of New York. Went to high school in Brooklyn, Boys High School, which at that time was a very exceptional kind of place. Then went on to the College of the City of New York, now part of City University, and then...
Talk, as you're sort of going through this, I'd be interested in hearing how some of the decisions were made. The City College, I know, is a real part of the New York tradition in terms of people going from high school to one of the city colleges.
Yeah, but it's more, but you see, I think there are other aspects, so even in the choice of a high school, for instance, the neighborhood where I lived, the neighborhood school was Samuel Tilden High School, yet I elected, and some of my friends did, to go to Boys High School, which necessitated me traveling about 3/4 of an hour on trolleys or buses and so forth, instead of just walking to the high school, because this was a school that had an intellectual tradition, and where a large part of the student body went on to not only to college education, but to graduate schools and so forth. And so there was a kind of tradition there, and a lot of the people that my family knew were graduates of Boys High School. And similarly, I could have opted to go to Brooklyn College, which was much closer, but Brooklyn College in those days was only beginning to be recognized as a intellectual entity, where City College was an established school. City College was the poor family's Harvard at that time. It was very difficult to get into. It was you needed a very high score in high school and so forth. So again, what I'm suggesting is parental influences and people who you associated with, and your own aspirations make these selections and these alternatives. And City College in the period from 1938 to 1942 was a fantastically exciting place to be in, both from the intellectual point of view and because of its association with so many of the movements at the time, the period of time in the war in Spain, the period of time just before World War II, and then the whole turmoil associated with the decision-making processes there and the student attitudes, and a large group of students who were exploring intellectually the possibilities of socialism and communism and as alternatives. They were all, as myself, products of the Depression, and then of course the Roosevelt era, which to many of us was very exciting. So it was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment, but at the same time, many of the students there, coming from families of modest means, knew that in order to get into professional schools, they had to do extremely well. And so there was and that was a negative from one point of view, tremendous competition for grades. You would have classes in which they would mark on a curve, so that means there was only going to be 1A or 2A's in a class or something like that, and everybody was fighting desperately for those A's. You know, if you got a B, you were disappointed. And in fact the people who were aspiring to medical school had better have almost a straight A average or they had to give up. But in any event, there was an intensity there. They had exciting times, difficult, but the pressures were stimulating, but I suppose anxiety producing, but also marvelous teachers, fantastic teachers. It was just a tremendously exciting place to be.
Tell me a little bit about the parental expectations. You mentioned that as being a stimulus for, you know, the search for Boys High and then for City College.
Yeah. Well, my parents both had come over as young people from, I guess, what would have been the eastern part of Poland, at the eastern part of Russia at the Polish border, but they came over very young. My mother was 6, my father was 10 or 11, and then they, you know, just went through high school, never had a chance to go to college. My father had aspirations of being a journalist, and actually he was an autodidact, and then he went to work as a cub reporter when he finished high school, and he went to work for the Waterbury Republican on his own, and actually spent a few years there. And I think that's given me a great stimulus and interest in writing. And then he enlisted in the World War I. But when he came back and met my mother, he realized that working as a reporter was not an adequate way of preparing for familiar responsibility, and he went into a business. But he always retained the interest in writing and in reading, and so it was taken for granted that the children would go on to college. And he had a number of friends who were lawyers and dentists and so forth, and so I always had the recognition and the feeling, and although the Depression was very, very tough, and the business he was in came close to failure several times.
What business was that?
He went into the automobile parts business. He was able to manage during those years, and so it was possible for me to go without having to work. Many of my friends could only go to college at night because the family income was just too modest, and it had to be enhanced by the young people in the family working as well. So that was a time in retrospect where the Depression, as you know, was a calamitous period, but it also, at least for those of us who had a modest but acceptable standard, of great excitement. And in terms of a career choice, medical, it was very, very clear to me early on in high school that I wanted to do something with the sciences. I love chemistry, I love biology. And yet, to be honest with you, I was a young hypochondriac, and the thought of going into medical school frightened me because I would begin to imagine all kinds of symptomology, and so I thought that medicine was not a good idea for me. Plus the fact that it was extremely difficult to get into. The opportunities for, at that time, there were discriminatory policies and quotas in virtually all of the medical schools, and only a very, very limited number of Jewish students were able to get into medical school. And although I was a competitor, I was not an intense competitor, and I did not aspire for the straight A's, and I had other interests. Largely, interestingly enough, I was a scoutmaster and spent a great deal of time doing that, and so I just wasn't prepared for that intensity of competition. And so dentistry appeared to me as a very reasonable alternative.
When was that decision made? Where in the process did you say?
Well, I didn't really make the decision that early. It was clearly a direction that I considered, and I think a major factor was the fact that I had a tremendous overbite, class 2 as a child, and I had orthodontic treatment. And it was a very lengthy process. And so I got very friendly with the orthodontist, and he had a young associate in his office who was actually a student in the postgraduate division in orthodontics and at Columbia, and so we got a little chummy and talked about Columbia and so forth, and that was began to think. But the real competition for me in terms of career choice, actually, once I recognized, because of the reasons I gave, that medicine was not for me, was actually whether I was going to go into chemistry rather than into dentistry, because I was a very good student, and I was selected out at the end of my sophomore year by a professor of analytical chemistry to work with him on research projects in my third and fourth year. And so I had the opportunity to do research in my junior and senior year. And actually, he was very generous, and I was a co-author of several papers, actually, while I was a student. And he was encouraging me to go on to take a doctorate in chemistry. But I guess it was my family pragmatism that suggested, since they didn't know anybody who had a doctorate in chemistry, and they knew a lot of dentists who made it living, that maybe I was better off doing that. And so I opted, I think, that, from the pragmatic point of view, for dentistry, but I did recognize, and when I had my initial interview at Columbia, one of the things I talked to, that was at the time Associate Dean Holliday, was the interview, what the research opportunities were at Columbia. And so they made it very clear to me that if I was accepted, that there would be opportunities to do research there. So suddenly, and that was the age of 19 and a half, hey, I could do both. I could be a dentist, and I could maybe do some research too. So it kind of fell together at that time. And it's exactly what happened.
Now, I know you have a long history at Columbia. We'll talk about that in a little while, but how about the choices of dental school?
Oh, well, that was very, very apparent to me for two reasons. Again, because, first of all, we couldn't afford to consider going any place but New York, you know. Actually, even in college and in professional schools, as far as my circle was concerned, there were only really two schools. There was New York schools and out-of-town schools, you know. There were no others. They all were like the New Yorker cartoon view of the rest of the world. So the choice then became New York University and Columbia. And I think for two reasons I chose Columbia, and only applied to Columbia, no place else. One was that NYU had tremendously large classes, and so the people who went there made it clear to me that there was one of the weaknesses there was that this feeling of being lost and anonymous, where the Columbia experience, and I had this young orthodontist and other people who I knew, the class size in those days was only about 45, and it's never gotten much more. We're about 60 now. And so there was a very personal attitude towards the individual student. And Columbia, as Dean Holliday explained to me very early on, had a tremendous reputation in research with many leading researchers. So I think the decision was very easy. The only difference it meant was a much longer subway ride from one end of Brooklyn to the upper end of Manhattan. It was about an hour and a half. But you learn to study on the subway, so that I never resented it.
And I know, sort of building towards this whole idea of dentistry as a life, not a living. You mentioned the Scoutmaster. I'm just sort of wondering what other kinds of things were going on for you in addition to all the studying that you were doing. Well,
no, that was really the only other thing was the Scoutmastering. Was my total extracurricular activity. Because it was so intense. In high school, the only other thing I really cared about was Herald Tribune used to have a contest every week for among the high school competitions, the story of the week. You know, and this was a time, we're talking about the 1937 and 1938, where the situation in Europe was horrendous, and literally every day in the newspaper there was something more about Hitler and what was happening and things. And so we had a group of us who used to form sort of a team, and we would all submit articles for the Herald Tribune, and they would give you cash prizes, $5 or $10, but more importantly, they would give you points, and then it was a competition among the various high schools for the points. And Boys High always won. And so that was very, of course it ended up, you know, that some of the people who were in Boys High at that time was Isaac Asimov, Harry Schwartz, who then became
These were classmates of yours?
No, they were a couple of years before me, but they were the people who inspired us as well, and a lot of other leading figures. We didn't know I.A.L. Diamond, Izzy Diamond, who became the partner of Billy Wilder in all the scripts in Hollywood, also was a high point scorer.
And the Herald Tribune.
Yeah, the Herald Tribune Story of the Week. In fact, it would be interesting to go back and to see where those people, I could tell you, because, you know, those names may not mean anything to you because it's 12, 15 years older than you are. But so many of the people who were involved in that became very prominent figures in many other areas and so forth. So that was an exciting time. At the City College period, between the 3 hours a day traveling and the kind of schedule you had to have to be able to fit into classes, and then doing 8 hours a week in the analytical laboratory on research, and then being a scoutmaster, it didn't leave very much time for anything else.
Now the war started right around then.
Yeah, the war started, of course, in '42. But what happened was, and I was very lucky there, and in a sense, is that when I got into dental school, it gave me the opportunity to apply for a special program that the Navy had, and I was successful in it, and I became an ensign in the, I forget the name of it, like the Medical Service Corps or something. In other words, the Navy was farsighted and in a sense beginning to recognize that they would need a cadre of professional people. Were providing the opportunity for people to kind of enlist in the Navy on a deferred service status. And so first I had this ensign rank, and then they had what's then was called the V-12 program. And so then I became a midshipman and stayed in uniform through dental school, and then of course went into the Navy on graduation. The Army picked this idea up a little later, ASTP, the Armed Services Training Program, and so virtually all of my class were either in Navy uniform or an Army uniform during dental school. And we did some drilling, forgive me the pun, actually on the streets of New York at 6 o'clock in the morning. We had to get there very early, and we'd do some drilling and marching. And of course, you don't march without somebody shouting a cadence. We were not very popular with the people who lived in the neighborhood. There was a fight in their own minds between patriotism and sleep, of course. In any event, so that we were able to stay in school during the war, and it was an accelerated program, so that we did the 4 years in 3 by eliminating vacations. I think we had a total of 2 weeks vacation during the whole year. And so it was tough, but it was exciting because you had the advantage of, in a sense, being part of a service and knowing that you would go into the service as an officer, as a dentist, and whereas so many of my college classmates, especially those who were in the ROTC, just got shipped off to the Philippines almost immediately. We lost a number of people very early on because they didn't have a substantial officer corps for the expansion of the services, and so they were taking all the people who had been in the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps, in the colleges, and shipping them out very, very quickly in all of the Pacifics areas and so forth. But any event, the Navy was interested in long-term training of dental officers, and so was able to stay through through dental school.
You graduated dental school in when?
45.
So
yeah.
you graduated just as the war was ending.
The war, actually, when I graduated, the war in Europe had ended. I was assigned to Naval Training Station in Sampson, which is in Geneva, New York, and during my first month there, the war with Japan ended. In August. I went in July 1st, and I think it was August 6th or 7th. So that I was in Sampson when the bombs went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then we actually, I stayed in another year. I was released because I'd already been married while at dental school, and so they gave you points for that, and so I was released at the end of the first year. But I did get called back again because I stayed in the reserve, and I spent 2 years during the Korean War as a naval dental officer.
Tell me how dental school worked out. I mean, the plan was to combine research and dentistry, and was there an opportunity to do that during those?
Oh yeah, you know, Columbia was, I think, is very unique. Columbia had a program that they called senior thesis. Every student had to do a research project in order to graduate, and that could be a purely library, although you were encouraged to do something of either a laboratory or a clinical nature, or a research, laboratory research. And most people started their senior thesis sometime in the beginning of the junior or middle of the junior year. I started my senior thesis within the first week I was in dental school, because when some of the people discovered that I had been trained in analytical chemistry and was interested in research, right during the course, in the freshman course in oral histology, Dr. Charles Francis Bodek and Dr. William Lefkowitz, who were very active researchers. Bodecker, of course, is the one who really in 1906 discovered or demonstrated the organic matter in enamel. And among their research interest was the whole area of the dental lymph, they called it, and the circulation within the tooth. Their view was that the tooth was a dynamic entity, that there was some metabolic turnover, and that they were working with the systems of using a variety of dyes to demonstrate the channels in the tooth. And when they discovered that I knew something about chemistry, they quickly enlisted me, and so I started working with them whenever I had a chance in the histology laboratory, and then began later on some animal experiments where we put crowns on on dogs' teeth, and I discovered that iodide is secreted into the saliva actively at about 20 times the concentration of blood. So what we did is we popped capsules of sodium iodide down the throats of the dogs, and then it went into the saliva, and then we were studying the entrance to see whether the saliva got into the tooth, and whether using a crown on the tooth would block it off. And then when we removed the teeth, we sectioned them. And then I developed approaches which were very primitive histochemical approaches to precipitate the iodide as a salt, a yellow-colored salt in the teeth, and then look at sections for that. In other words, this really became the predecessor of the studies with radioactive iodide that Herb Bartlestone and I then did some years later. But the point here was that I was doing research throughout dental school, that I had wonderful mentors and people who were looking for students who would do research. And we had other active researchers at Columbia, Max Caution in biochemistry, the famous Ted Roseberry in microbiology, Eddie Applebaum, and Moses Diamond in anatomy, all were doing research, all encouraged students who are interested in research to participate. And it was a very exciting time.
I'm curious, I mean, I know the influence that had in terms of your career. To what degree did it change your classmates?
Well, now, there were quite a number of us who went into research.
What about the ones who didn't?
Now, the ones who didn't, many of them found research projects that dealt with clinical subjects, or oral medicine was very big. I think that, I would say, it's hard for me to tell, I would say there was a section of the class who, as a result of it, and our class still gets together and we have reunions, I would say maybe 25% of the class still retains an interest in research. A few of them have stayed in academia. Actually, a number of my classmates went on to be a head of orthodontics, Nick DeSalvo, head of operative dentistry, Ed Kane, a number of people went into oral surgery, and so forth. So that we had at least a half a dozen people who stuck with research in one form or another.
Let me ask the question still another way. I'm wondering the degree to which it affects that idea of every student having to do a research project. I guess is fairly unique. I imagine if you went across dental schools, I don't know how many at the present time even require that.
No, very. I don't know if any of them do. But it didn't last very much longer at Columbia because it got to be too difficult as the curriculum expanded and the needs expanded.
And to what degree do are the clinicians different? The person who says, I'm going to go out into private practice, and this person has had this research experience as part of their dental school education. To what degree are they different practitioners?
Well,
would you imagine?
Well, it's hard to tell because I would have to answer it from
What's your opinion?
My opinion is that only a modest number of them really are affected by it, because I'm asked that question quite often, whether we should mandate some research experience in the dental school. And over the years, I've come to the decision that the answer is no. I think that dental students should be exposed to research techniques. In other words, to be aware of what's going on, to have some lectures integrated within the various courses that talk about the research. That opportunities, however, should be available right from the beginning for those students who have the itch to be able to scratch. In other words, I feel that a major part of the determination whether somebody goes into research and should be encouraged and mechanisms developed for participation in research has to come from viscerally from the student who is curious, who wants to know answers to questions, who is not satisfied with just the acceptance of it. So there has to be this drive. Also, there have to be role models in a school. And Columbia, we were very lucky. We had we had a number of role models, including even in the clinical areas, a few people who had the research interest. But by and large, at least at that time, the school tended to be divided into the clinicians and, what, for want of a better term, the biologists. And there were clinicians who tended to deprecate the research and the waste of time and so forth. But the other side of it, of course, were those researchers who were so stimulating in themselves that they had an impact on the students. And so the school had an honorary research society, William Jarvie Society, where members were elected, 5 members from each class were elected each year, and in order to get into it, you had to have done some original research and had either presented it to the society or a table clinic or something. And so by the end of the four year, you would have at least 20 students in each class who had been active in it. So I think there was an environment where I recently did a history of our dental school, and to me, me, this was the research enterprise. It permeated the school. It unfortunately did not. There was a period of time where it dropped down very considerably and then revived again. But I think that that period of the late 30s and through the 40s were very exciting and very unique there, and it was very special. From this experience, I learned that students can do excellent research, that those students who are interested should be encouraged to do research, that the mentoring is very critical. And mentoring is more than just an assignment of a student to a laboratory. Mentoring means a support system for students, an encouragement of it. And that's not easy to come by.
Tell me about how you experience those things, the role models and the mentoring.
Well, as I say, I name dropping, you know, Bodecker and Lefkowitz were the most immediate role models, and then Edward Applebaum as well, and then Ted Roseberry, who was not only a superb microbiologist, but a marvelous writer and lecturer. I would go to him with papers and so forth. Dan Ziskin was a very exciting man and really brought oral medicine to a high state. And, long before it became, you know, the specialty view. And a number of other people there. So I experienced as an exciting, supportive system, and I made up my mind that come what may, I was going to spend at least a part of my professional time in the dental school. And so I made that known to people that I had worked with, Koshin and Ziskin and so forth. So when I got out of the Navy at the end of that first year stint, they made it possible for me to join the research, clinical research unit as a research assistant 2 days a week without salary. And so it was, at one point of view, as a sacrifice. At the other point of view, it's an opportunity. Right. And so I started as an associate in an office in order to be able to make, believe me, a very bare living while I began to learn a little bit more about research. And actually, I spent 10 years doing research half-time without ever getting paid.
So now this was the period between your first stint in the Navy
and the second, yeah, from 46 to 52. I was a research assistant and then an instructor on a half-time basis.
No salary?
No salary. And I would come in 2 days a week and work in the laboratories, and I began to give some lectures in a course called oral hygiene, which then became cariology as the course developed.
Now then for 2 years, then you needed to give that up when you went into the Navy?
Yeah, I gave up my office, right, went into the Navy. But even in the Navy, interestingly enough, I was assigned to the Army because they had a shortage of dental officers. I was assigned to Fort Eustis, Virginia. And we had a study club, and we had a number of us who were very interested in research. In fact, I went to Richmond a couple of times, and I visited with Cy Kreshover, who then became head of the National Institute of Dental Research, because my mentor at Columbia, before I left to go into the Navy the second time, was Barnett Levy, Bar Levy, who was really very special to me and really was the one who taught me how to do research. He knew Cy because he had taught in Virginia for a while. And so I had an opportunity to spend a little time with Cy Kreshover. Just the kind of feeling. I also had been a member of the American Association of Dental Research, so twice I went to dental research meetings. And so, in fact, I even did a review paper which got published in the Journal of the American Dental Association on caries etiology. And so I kind of had the opportunity to kind of keep my hand in, not in a laboratory, but at least in terms of the literature and in terms of talking to people.
Was there any doubt that you were going to go back to Columbia when this was over?
No. It was I was on leave.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a little doubt, only from the point of view is that I got friendly with some of the local dentists in Newport News, and there were opportunities to stay there and practice, and the lifestyle was very nice there, and I could have, made obviously a decent living, but it would have been too limiting. And we had family in New York, so there was no question about coming back.
No question about coming back to New York, and no question about going back to Columbia.
No, and I had a practice in New York, modest part-time practice, but at least I had a base for, quotes, making a living.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back to Columbia, and got involved at that time really much more vigorously in research. I think the period before was kind of a learning. I was just learning microbiology and histology, and not really publishing very much, although I did do some work with the radioactive iodide, and we did a study on the early use of a penicillin toothpaste, and I did some work on caries activity tests and things of that sort. But my real research in depth, it didn't start until I came back in '54.
What triggered that? What was the catalyst?
Well, I think the catalyst for the real research was Paul Levy.
Mm.
Yeah. And he and I became very warm friends, and his interest at that time were manifold, but histochemistry was becoming to be a major tool. And so having had the training in chemistry and had learned something about histology and histochemistry, we began to work together, and the first projects that we worked together on was the development of plaque and calculus, and beginning to look at the mechanism of calculus formation, first from a histochemical point of view and then from a chemical point of view, and then the influences that saliva had on the process, and those were directions I began to take for a good part of my career: plaque, calculus, calcifications, and then saliva. And at that time, the new techniques were coming in: electrophoresis, paper electrophoresis, very exciting, gel electrophoresis, immunochemistry. Art Ellison, who was in the class behind me, took his PhD in microbiology, influenced by Elvin Cabot and some of the other people in the department in immunochemistry. And so we worked together, and we were really, and it was Art who took the initiation, were the first to demonstrate the presence of antibodies in saliva using histochemical techniques. And then I had developed first the paper and then the disc gel electrophoretic techniques for saliva. And then we combined that with histochemistry and chemistry and immunology, and we began to identify all the various proteins in saliva. And so that was a very, very exciting period of time.
Had you ever thought of getting a PhD?
I thought of it, I couldn't afford it. You see, we did have a program in school.
All those years working for free.
Well, but I still needed, the PhD was still full-time.
Right,
and the fellowship at that time was $2,500 a year. I already had one child and then a second child on the way, and there was just no way that I could afford to do it. I suppose in retrospect I regret it, but it was just, it didn't seem to be practical financially, and secondly, I wasn't convinced at that time that I needed. I was a subscriber to the Hang Around You Learn school, and I was very fortunate that I had good role models, and I was in a medical school environment, basic science department, where many, many of the young people in the other departments were friends and classmates of mine from City College. And so I would go to their laboratories, and they would show me. And so I learned a tremendous amount just from interaction with these people. I don't think you could do this again, and I encourage all of us students interested in research to take take advantage of the training programs, which didn't start until 49 actually. But in those days, it was still possible to do by interaction with other people and, again, with mentors.
Interesting. We're going to stop now.
Okay.
For a little break.
Just getting warmed up, right?
Yeah, well, Dr. Mandel, hearing about all of this energy that was going into research, and that whole philosophy of learning by hanging around, how much of that do you think was part of being in the right place at the right time?
Well, I think a lot of it was being in the right place at the right time, because Columbia had this concentration of people interested in research. Eventually, if you look back at the history, they were recruited for that purpose, originally from Minnesota and some of them from University of Buffalo and so forth. So we really had what has come to be called the critical mass of people at that time. But for a variety of reasons, a number of them left. And so you began to lose that. And then in 1957, Barnett Levy, who was the head of the research laboratory, moved to the University of Texas in Houston, and a new dean came in, Gilbert Smith, and he was a superb clinician, virtuosity in the Crown and Bridge and so forth, and he did not really have a strong interest in research, and in fact made it very apparent where his inclinations lay. And so we no longer, actually the senior thesis I think had been dropped a few years before, but there was no longer this research ferment in the dental school, and so it became very difficult to sustain it on a school-wide basis. But we did have people who were interested. We had the continuation of the oral medicine tradition initiated by Dan Ziskin in the person of Dr. Edward Zegarelli, and then he brought in another young man, Austin Kutcher, and I took over the laboratory from Barnett Levy, and we were able to sustain a modest research program in oral medicine and stomatology, and actually I was part of the division of stomatology at that time. And so we kept it going, but not nearly with the same intensity or breadth than during what might be the golden years in the late 30s and 40s. And it didn't again begin to take off until Dr. Smith retired as dean, and Melvin Morse, who was a dentist, PhD in anatomy, took over. And it was...
That year was?
I think that was 68. And with Melvin Morse, the opportunity for marked expansion in research took place, because I think that the university and the medical center recognized that the school, being part of a medical center and part of a leading university, could not afford, in a sense, to place that almost exclusivity on the clinical side of dentistry, and really had to take steps to expand the research base beyond just the laboratory that I had inherited and had developed with substantial NIH funding through the 60s.
Now, is that sort of time with the maturation of the National Institute of Dental Research?
Oh, absolutely. The National Institute of Dental Research started in 1948. They began their training programs and their grant programs in the early 50s. And that funding began to increase very slowly, but by 1960, when I was I think had the credentials as a principal investigator in the areas of saliva, calculus, plaque, and so forth, having had a number of publications, I was able to get NIDR support, and that continued for nearly the next 30 years.
30 years of NIDR support.
Yeah, all through the plaque calculus salivary period, and in the last period, up to about 2 years ago, was on salivary studies in HIV infection. So that I was able to sustain it with that. The school, in a sense, wasn't in a position either financially or in terms of actual faculty positions to encourage more research until Melvin Morse became dean in '68, because I think as part of the package that was developed for him to take over the position, there were a number of new faculty lines created. In fact, that was what gave me the opportunity to finally give up practice completely and to go into full-time, because I was able to get an appointment as a full-time professor of preventive dentistry, and we established the Department of Preventive Dentistry and Community Health. We established a Department of Growth and Development. We were able to bring in Robert Gottsagen as a full-time director of the Division of Periodontics, and a number of more junior appointments, so that the school set out in '68 on an expanded research course, and it began to feel once again as it had in the 40s, and has now reached the point where we're not one of the big ones, but we're in the I think the upper third or upper fifth of supported institutions, and we do get a substantial amount of industry support, because one of the things that I was able to develop, because the university made some additional space available, was a Center for Clinical Research. You see, part of the problems in urban schools is space. There is a tremendous competition for space. All the departments are vying for space because you can't spread laterally, you build vertically. And where we are at Columbia, we're on rock, literally, and to try to get new buildings created, which we finally did after all of these years, they're very, very difficult. And so there is really an intense competition for space, and so we were limited.
Within the school and between the school and other schools up there.
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, the departments are all very supportive, and that was enabled me to do a lot of interdisciplinary research with many other departments. By the same time, everybody is, in a sense, expansionist, and they want to move out, they want to bring in new people. To attract new people, you need space. And so there's this constant vying for space, and it's become a very competitive field in many of these medical centers, because one of the basic questions that the administrators ask is, well, how much income can that space generate? And this is perhaps a very cold way of putting it, but that's what they expect, that there is generation of space. You know, to me, it's almost as if you're part of a big shopping mall, you know, and whether or not you can get the space is how much per square foot you can generate, you know, and if somebody else can come in and generate more money, it's not quite that bad because the university is supportive. But the fact is that there are contesting demands all the time, and space is the limiting factor here.
Interesting.
Yes.
Let me talk about a thing, an appointment that came up, I guess it was in the 80s for you, and that was your appointment to the, I guess it was the ADA Future of Dentistry.
One of the most exciting times of my life.
Tell me about that.
Well, you know, if you remember, in the early 80s, there was was the recession and an overexpansion of student enrollment in many schools to take advantage of what had been the flush years of government support programs. We had some of the schools that were turning out students every 3 years. We had some schools that would have 2 classes for a year in the beginning, the 3-year student and the 4-year student. And so there was this tremendous number of new dentists being, in a sense, flooding the market. At the same time, there was an economic recession. And so it was very difficult. And of course, as you know, some dental schools closed. A lot of opposition by practitioners in the various dental societies in terms of the schools, and they saw that they were by overtraining so many students, or from the numbers point of view, that it was making difficulty for them. It was a terribly troubling time, and the profession didn't know where it was going. Plus, it was at the same time that we had some of the successes for preventive dentistry, so we began to discover that caries had dropped precipitously, that the oral hygiene approaches, the plaque control, it was having an impact on periodontal disease. So you had this confluence of a recession, an overabundance for a short period of new dentists, reduced the caries rate, and a terrible concern in the profession that we were really almost obsolescent. And I'm sure you recall in magazine articles and Forbes magazines and so forth.
So what was your sense about what was going on?
Well, my feeling was that this was a turmoil stage, but I perennial optimist, thought that this was a short period of time that could be overcome, and that there was a misreading of the situation, that actually once there was recognition and once there was no longer this attraction of federal money for training, this lucre taxis, you know, that the schools go where the money is, like the Willie Horton syndrome, that would stop, and which it did. And I felt that there was a misreading of the data on caries, that there certainly had been a major impact, but that caries was not over as a disease. It was not going to become extinct. There was a shifting in the pattern, that we were getting an aging population with retaining teeth, with gingival recession, with root caries, with more moderate but pervasive periodontal disease, with new technologies coming in and new information, that this was a potentially exciting time for the profession. So I was delighted when I was invited by the ADA to join the Future of Dentistry Committee, mostly in a sense as the research representative, because I had been chairman of the Council on Dental Research for a number of years at the ADA, and a consultant in the Council on Dental Therapeutics, so that I was not an unreasonable choice, and I welcomed that opportunity, and it proved to be, I think, both a very exciting and a very productive program.
If you think back, that was about 10 years ago, 1982.
Yes, just about. It was over in 83, right.
How, if you were to look back at at what came out of that commission in terms of 1992, how much on the mark were you?
Well, I think we were on the mark to a great extent there. First of all, I think we helped to put the situation in perspective, and we showed that. Well, let me retrace a little bit. I think the most important thing that came out of this Future of Dentistry Committee and the strategic plan that was developed was that the professional role changed from a passive one, where we always were responding to the situations that were imposed, to one in which the professional organization recognized that they should and could play a role by analyzing, planning, working closely with the dental schools, working more closely with the legislative bodies, encouraging legislative interaction, not just from the point of view of protecting the turf, but from the point of view of being the experts in an area. I think it helped change the image of the organization and how they could function. So I think that was very good. I think in terms of the specifics of it, they were very much on the mark. We recognized that there was a thrust, a preventive thrust, which was having an impact, but that the timetable that had been thought of, that by the end of the century, dental decay would be over as a disease, there would be no need for dentists and so forth, has proved to be not so at all. It's just shifted and reduced the form somewhat, but created more opportunities for a greater interest in periodontal disease, for a greater interest in orthodontics, with the implant dentistry, of course, and new directions for it. So I think that as an expanding profession rather than a retrenching profession, I think it was on the mark. I think that dental schools reacted to market forces and reduced numbers. I happen to think that some of the places overreacted for their own reasons, and I think some of the projections are that we might end up with an expanding population in general and a retrenching population of graduate, that we may have some disparity there. So I think we were right there. I think we were right that we felt that the four-year dental school was not adequate, that we had to encourage some form of a fifth year, a compensated fifth year, in terms of more residencies available, in terms of more fellowship programs available, the advanced education general dentistry aspects, and schools have responded to that. And the fact that the profession is changing rapidly, that there has to be more thrust in continuing education, there has to be more opportunities for a more open profession. So I think we set the stage for a lot of things. The one thing we never anticipated, of course, was the AIDS and the impact that this would have, and the infection control, but nobody could anticipate this, and yet I think that what you had was an organization that had begun to change, to be responsive to the situations, and so I think that they were in a better position to respond to some of these pressures because we had kind of reorganized, and because we had a strategic plan, and because we became more cognizant of the importance of a planning approach to things. And I think it paid off in terms of how the profession has been able to respond to these pressures.
In the light of that, in going through some of the things that you've written, in the Journal of the American Dental Association, there was an article, Changing Dental Images from Stone Tablets to Comic Strips. We'll talk about some of your writing interests. But you say in here, dentistry is undergoing an identity crisis. And I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, you see, when I said identity crisis at that time, I meant was that for at least a good part of my professional life, you knew what to expect in practice. The materials hadn't changed very much. There were advances, but they were slow. What you were expected to do in an office was fairly circumscribed. Suddenly, we had this tremendous influx of new technologies, new materials. We had this shift in the pattern of the dental disease. We had this shift in the expectations of the public that it was not only functional but aesthetic. We had the shift in the payment systems. It was not only the traditional ones but the third parties, be they the insurance company or the government, Medicaid, and so forth, became a much greater part of it. There was the movements towards new forms of practice. For a while we thought we would be taken over by the malls with the shopping center practices and so forth. The pressures for the peer review, no longer daddy knew best, but there was somebody looking over the shoulder. You had to be familiar with all of the forms. Computers came in and they began to change the way the thing was organized. There was this combobulation, and you really did not know what a dentist meant anymore. You weren't just putting in amalgams and extracting teeth and putting in partials. The expectations were tremendous, and so many people really had to, in a sense, restructure the image of dentists and of dentistry. dentistry. And I think we're still undergoing that identity crisis. Part of the problem we see is this desire to keep the hold and the style that we're accustomed to, and the desire for continuity, and trying to balance this with these rapid changes, this acceleration of change that Arthur Schlesinger calls it, the pace of change. And so this is really very discombobulating for a lot of people. And so that's really what I meant by identity crisis.
If you were going to be writing the Future of Dentistry report now, how much different would it look?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we would, well, first of all, if I was writing it,
That's what you'd do if you were
writing it, yeah, because we had loads of disagreement there, but the beauty of it is that we were able to develop a consensus conceptually of where the problems were. I would see the profession perhaps continuing to be on pretty much where the numbers are, maybe even a slight expansion. But what I would see is really getting the profession, and I know there'll be a lot of argument in taking the lead in a broader biological medical base. We still almost have this contention between as if it was two separate worlds, the clinicians and the biologists and so forth. Today, I think it's a continuum. I think that the AIDS epidemic and infection control has really shown that there is a biological imperative in dentistry. I think that the demographics with an aging population clearly suggest that the training has to be more biologically and medically based. And there almost has to be a requirement for a 5th year, but you can't impose it until there are more opportunities. But I would emphasize and reinforce some of the points that we made. And there has to be an emphasis on continuing education. There's no way that this profession can survive unless we graduate dentists who recognize that there's a lifetime of learning here. And it's not just going to a meeting and getting something signed so that they have the credits, but it means that this has to be an ongoing thing. There's no way that you're going to be able to practice dentistry in the future the way you did in the past with this finite set of techniques, materials, attitudes. No way.
Just coming back to something you said, I had marked something in something that you had written in the International Dental Journal in which you talk about the new challenge, and it's called, this last sentence says, physicians of the mouth who are restorative virtuosi offer a wondrous combination. It means a lifetime of dedication to continuing education and professional growth energized by research.
Yeah, but there was a sentence before that, and that is that you also had to be a physician of the mouth in a sense as well as a technical virtuoso. In other words, I do not imply, because of my thrust towards the biology and the medical aspects, that the clinical is not important. I do not envision, at least for the next generation or two of dentists, that you can practice without a handpiece, because there is just too much that remains to be done because of the needs of the whole baby boom generation, plus the fact that we haven't talked about the changing population. It's not only the geriatric increase. What you have is the influx of the Latinos, the Asian Americans. If you look at the way the population is going in terms of birth rates and numbers, the relative proportions of these populations are changing, so that at the same time that you have this need for the highly sophisticated dentistry, you also have tremendous needs for more of a preventive and a public health effect. And I could have added to that a public health philosophy. We in the profession, in fact, that's another point that I would make if we were writing A Future of Dentistry, this whole access to care issue, this whole issue of responding to the tremendous needs in healthcare reform and the responsibility that we have to these populations. Most of the dental disease, the haves in terms of dental disease are the have-nots socioeconomically, and we have to develop programs for them. And that's a tremendous need which we have not been adequately addressing as a population. So I really see this profession as getting more complex, not tighter, with broader responsibilities. And I think professional organizations have to play a major role in this. You can't, the schools can't do this themselves, or should they do it themselves? It has to be a partnership.
Yeah, I want to. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the in terms of that partnership, but the theme that I see running through a lot of these articles really is that whole idea of the sort of the research practice partnership and the interplay between the two.
Right.
And I mean, it seems in some way that that interplay between the research and practices pretty much typifies your career.
Well, this may color how I respond to your question, but I think that it also typifies this profession, which I called it clinical research in one article, which will be out shortly, the silent partner of dental practice. I don't think that there has been enough appreciation by the practice community of the contributions of research, and I don't think there is a close enough contact with the research community, and many of us feel that the big lag in this profession is what's called the technology transfer, or the diffusion of these technologies, that we tend to be, in a sense, captives of our basic training in dental school. And unless we develop in dental school the philosophy that this is a changing profession, and unless we develop better systems of continuing education so that these new ideas can be included critically into the practice. That's another important point here. We have a tendency to depend too much on some of the advertising and the detail, just as the physicians have that with the detail men in the drugs. We have the same thing with that with materials and techniques and so forth. Dental schools have to help impart a critical sense into students for the future.
The other piece that strikes me as I go through the things that you've written and see the change over time was sort of the movement in some of the later writing to things that kind of reflects, I guess, maybe some of your other interests. And I noticed more articles about the history of dentistry, and this one, which is Dentistry's Prospects for the Future, and it also sounds like it's talking about you. Many dentists are sculptors, painters, or musicians, or involved in real estate, golf, or politics. Dentistry can allow for a balanced life and a fulfilling one. The possibilities are many. Embrace and relish them.
Yeah. Well, you know, this becomes an extension of where we started with dentistry as a life, not just a living. And that is, I feel that we're very lucky in dentistry that many people, once they have established practices, really, unless they're have tremendous financial needs for a variety of things, can make a good living, probably on a four-day-a-week practice. And so there are opportunities to do other things professionally, to be part of dental school faculties, to be part of dental departments in hospitals, perhaps to donate time in public health facilities so that they can do more than that and get a broader perspective, or to also take the opportunity to expand culturally and educationally in terms of other kind of courses, and to have a greater breadth. And I feel that that's very important for dentists to do. Not that I have any objection to golf or real estate or what have you, but I think that a rich life should be broader based.
So tell me what Irwin Mandel is doing.
Well, you see, once I reached the point where I no longer run a laboratory and have responsibility for supervising a lot of research on a day-by-day basis, the papers obviously will no longer be research database papers, because I'm not generating, although I still owe a couple of papers. But I've always had an interest in literature, in theater, and in history, and so I'm trying to combine them together. And actually, what you saw here, the article on changing dental images, I did one on dental caries some years ago. I did one on why pick on teeth some years ago, and now I'm doing a series for the ADA, for the Journal of the American Dental Association. I hope to come out. Larry Meskin has asked me to do one every 3 months on a research-related topic. So my first one, which will be out in the January issue, is salivary diagnosis, an area that I helped create, more than a lick and a promise. And then I have a whole series of essays planned. So what my hope is over the next couple of years is to do a series of articles, essay type, and put them all together. You know, I have no pretensions of being another Lewis Thomas, but in a modest way, I feel that such an approach in dentistry, maybe the time has come.
Tell me about the article you're doing on the theater.
Oh, well, this one is will be out in the next issue of the Bulletin of the History of Dentistry, and that I was very intrigued by the way playwrights look at dentists, and so I compare 4 playwrighs: George Bernard Shaw, who has a major character as a dentist in the play You Never Can Tell, and Graham Greene, who has one in The Complacent Lover, A. Burroughs, Cactus Flower, that people all know from the movie, but was a play. And then a very well-known play in the 30s, Rocket to the Moon, by Clifford Odets. All have dentists as the major male role. And so I was comparing each of them and trying to look for the common denominators. And so that's the kind of article I like to do more of.
In the article that was written about you when you got the ADA Gold Medal Award, there was an interview with Dr. Scholey about. There were a couple of things in here that I thought were interesting, and I just was wondering. This is now almost 7 years later. There was one comment in here. It said, "Traditional dental education teaches rigidity. It does not teach flexibility. Tends to be defensive. We get generations of students who model themselves after their heroes in the clinical departments and who are the superb operators."
Right. Well, you know, this was my view of what happens is that the dental student very often starts out in the first year very excited about the biological sciences, gets very excited about oral histology and anatomy and so forth, and asks all sorts of basic questions and the relevance to oral health problems, and then gets into technical dentistry, gets into the preclinical and then the early clinical, and suddenly the mood shifts. They become frightened to death and not stimulated. They worry because they're back to the kindergarten level, because unless they've done sculpting or something else, or you know, furniture making, they really have no sense whether their hands are capable of doing these things. And they find that their early efforts are so primitive and difficult, and then when they get onto the clinical floor, the people who help them become dentists, as they traditionally have defined it, have been the operative and the prosthetic people and so forth. They're back to role models. And so instead of the people who are the microbiologist and the immunologist and the physiologist and the histologist and so forth, the clinical dentist becomes the role model. And the way they envision it, unless they consider going into certain specialties or to research careers, is, you know, to be able to, in quotes, to make a living. And so here are these people who are helping them enter this unknown profession where they're going to have to depend on their hands to make the living. And then these are the people who guide them. These are the people whose offices they visit, you know, on a Saturday to see what that's like. And then they hear that these are the people who get invited to continuing education programs, and they become, in my day, they were the full-mouth rehabilitation people. Today, they'll be the implantologist or what have you. And so you begin to deprecate the beginnings. And the trick is, by the end of the 4th year is when you become a little bit more comfortable with that, and you begin to see the challenges of working with people and the need to interact with people and the need to understand the biology of people. The hope is that they'll start to put it together. Now, up to now, or up to fairly recently, many people never put it together. They separated out those two roles and never kind of recombined them. And I think that's the challenge of dental education now, is to get students to recognize the need for the recombination. That's the role of the 5th year. That's the role of the residency program and the fellowship programs, to get the opportunity to put it all together, and then to go out into practice as a whole practitioner, not closed off to the biological, medical, behavioral, etc. And it's not easy to do, especially when you go out and you're faced with the enormous debt that you have, the expenses of an office, the need to quickly develop an income base. Hopefully, if they've selected appropriately and they can begin to develop a practice, and they can begin to take a sigh of relief and begin to use that part of their background that has been lying fallow, they'll put it together.
Anything I've forgotten to ask you?
It's hard to believe. No, I think you've covered it all. I just want to emphasize that I feel it is even more so than when I started in dental school just 50 years ago, an exciting profession. And I know that a lot of people have a lot of negativity because of some of the difficulties and so forth, the infection control problems and the third-party payment problems. But I think if students are trained as part of their school experience to build in infection control, working with rubber gloves in the beginning, if they build in the fact that they have to be trained in dealing with appropriate financing arrangements, in the use of computers, etc. In the dental school, they won't find practice the shock that some of the older practitioners find, and they may see this more as a challenge than as a harassment.
When you look back over your career, are there any regrets?
Only I wish I had been in a position to take a PhD, because I think it would have given me an opportunity to do research at a somewhat deeper level than I was able to do. But outside of that, I've been extraordinarily lucky, and no, I made the right choice.
And you've made the sacrifices.
I never thought of them really as sacrifices. My wife made the sacrifices because I had all the enjoyment and she had some of the limitations. And she had to postpone her career development for quite a few years until she could move out. That's another aspect that I think the relationships are different today, and opportunities have to be made for the spouse in either way, in either direction, to develop as well. So I think the needs are quite different than they were, and I'm not quite sure how that would work out. But I think each generation just has to solve them.
Do you, I know you're sort of in this early retirement, quasi-retirement, although you sound busy enough with your writing. Is there any unfinished business?
Well, in terms of, I know what you mean by unfinished business. I look at all of this thrust towards a historical approach and a literary approach as unfinished because I've wanted to do this right along. And I want a little bit more flexibility in my life and the opportunity to broaden my reading and the opportunity to take other courses so that I can begin to move out of just purely the professional base. In a sense, one point of view, almost always taken the easy way out, and that is take advantage of the talents that I've had and the opportunities that I have. And I would like to explore other areas, but not losing track of my dental connectedness and my obligation to the profession. So I still see that as a core attitude and function. And how I'm actually going to do the mixing as time goes on, I'm interested in seeing what will happen.
Me too.
Okay, pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Good for you, boy. No idea what was coming.